In this lesson, we're going to talk about ZModeler. ZModeler is a poly modeling tool that's inside of ZBrush. It's similar to the type of poly modeling that you would do in Maya or Modo or 3D Studio Max, but it's based around the brush system. And it's really quite cool in the way that it allows you to extrude faces, extrude edges, and work on polygon elements in a slightly different fashion than you might be accustomed to. So I have a poly star up on screen right now, and I'm going to go to the tool menu here, and at the bottom there is an initialize menu. Now, I can use this to create a primitive cube or a primitive grid. So you see there's a quick cube, quick sphere, quick grid. And if I select one of these, I've got my resolution already set here. So if I select Q cube and go into frame mode, you see it's 2 by 2 by 2. So this is a nice way to sort of start with a primitive. This gives you polygroups on each side. And now if we want to start using ZModeler on this, I'll press B for brush, Z for ZModeler, and that brings up the ZModeler menu or button brush here. If I select that, it says that it works best if dynamic draw size is enabled. Just always tell that OK. Now you see our brush behaves a little differently. As we mouse over a face, it lights up and says Q mesh a poly. If I mouse over an edge, it lights up the edge and points light up as points. Now, if I mouse over a face and then press the space bar, this brings up the ZModeler menu. This is the meat and potatoes of the tool, so to speak. The top menu is going to be the operation, and this is contextual. This is for polygons, as you can see here. Had I moused over an edge and pressed the space bar, I'll get a different set of actions. Those are for the edges. So the face under my brush, I press the space bar, and it defaults to Q mesh. And Q mesh is just sort of a face extrusion like plus. It does some really neat things that normal face extrusion tends not to do in other programs. The next thing we have is our target. So we can make our target a single polygon, which would just be this poly. If I click and drag, it only Q meshes that polygon. If I turned on X symmetry, it would work symmetrically. If I change this to polygroup island, it's going to grab every polygrouped face that's touching one another. So it'll do this. Were I to change this to edge loop, this is going to perform the operation on the edge loop. Now, that's the poly loop, pardon me. You see there's an orange line there. That determines the direction of the poly loop. So if I click and drag, it's going to Q mesh out this poly loop. If I change the angle this way just by moving my brush up so the orange line is pointing up, it does that poly loop. So we have a really enormous amount of freedom in how we select and how we execute different actions on various faces, and we can really get down to a granular level as to what faces are going to be affected. The rest of these faces, or the rest of these options, are just going to be other parameters like alignment steps and other modifiers. So let's take a look at how this works. If I Q mesh a single poly, I'm going to press the space bar and I'm going to change this to single poly, and I'm just going to Q mesh this poly out, and then I'll do it again, and we get these two extrusions. Then if I bring my mouse over here, grab these faces, bring these forward, we do this. Now, I said Q mesh does some neat things that normal extrusions don't usually do. If I bring these two faces together, when they meet, they're going to merge. So I don't have to worry about selecting vertices and welding them. Now, if I want to set a temporary polygroup, I can just Alt-click on a face, and that's going to polygroup those faces temporarily. Now, if I mouse over these faces and press the space bar, we can change our action. Let's do inset, not insert, but inset. And we will inset center and border, and we will do each poly. So if I click and drag, now I'm going to get an extrusion pattern here, and it's going to automatically polygroup that new face in the center. Now, if I press the space bar and go back to Q mesh, I'm still on single poly. It remembers my selection. I can Q mesh this out. But again, like I said, Q mesh does some cool things. If I push them in, when it meets that other face, it will just punch a hole right through there. So that's really handy because that sort of thing can be a little tricky, time-consuming to do in Maya, you know, compared to this. This is very, very much quick and easy. Knock the face through, and you have a hole with welded faces. Now, ZModeler only works on a mesh that has no subdivision levels. But what if we want to see what this is going to look like smoothed? If I want to see that, we're going to use dynamic subdivisions. Now, we touch on dynamic subdivisions in a couple other chapters. We talk about this with regards to the folders and Booleans. The way dynamic subdivision levels works is the hotkey to step up your subdivision levels is the letter D. If I press that, and I don't have any subdivision levels on my mesh, ZBrush is going to ask me if I want to enable dynamic subdivision. So I'm going to say yes. I'm actually going to say always yes because I'm not going to need to change that option right now. So now we see what this looks like where it's smoothed. Now I can change these settings by going to Geometry, Dynamic Subdivisions here. Now you can see that I've got flat subdivs. If I change this slider, this is going to give me something that looks like what would happen if I took a mesh and smoothed it with the SMT modifier turned off. So what that is, just to show you, if you've got a hard surface model in ZBrush, a lot of people don't know this. If I have something like a polycube and I start smoothing this, it becomes quite soft on the edges. If I want to retain the sort of hard surface volumes of this, if I turn off SMT, that's the smooth modifier. So if I add a couple subdivision levels with that turned off and then turn it on, I can smooth, and what it's going to do, it's going to give me a nice retention of the volume. So that's what's happening here if I use my flat subdivs. It's just giving me the approximation of what that would look like, and that works particularly well for hard surface type models where we don't want them to be faceted, but we also want to give them a little bit of a smoothness. Now, as I mouse over components here, you can see it's highlighting the component out there in space where it actually sits in three-dimensional space without the illusion of the dynamic subdivision level applied to it. If I bring my flat subdivs down and my Q grid, bring that down to 0 and go into frame mode, here you can see I can actually see the points of my mesh. So I could grab these and move these around, similar to kind of subdivision surface modeling. So let's bring our flat subdivs up to 1, and then we'll make some changes to this. I'll mouse over an edge this time, press the space bar, and I want to crease these edges so they're sharper. So I'll select crease, and I want to do edge loop complete. So if I click here, it will crease that complete edge loop, giving me a nice sharp edge on that hole. Maybe I want to do the same thing here. I'll crease these edges, and I'll crease these edges. Sometimes you have to get just the right angle to catch that edge. There it is. And crease. Now, if I were to mouse over a face and go back to inset, this can go very, very quickly. Once you've got the hang of these tools, I can inset these faces, I can inset these faces, and I can just Q mesh this by hitting the space bar, going to Q mesh, and then I'll just push that straight through, and we've carved holes right through there. Now, if I want to make some other changes to this, for example, if I select, let's grab this edge here, I can bevel. So I will select the bevel tool here, and you see the options for the bevel are down there. I can do a single row, 2 rows, 4 rows, and I can change my sharpness to the edges. So if I were to click and drag this edge now, I can add a bevel to it. And that's one of the things I find really handy, because very, very rarely do you want your models to have perfect 90-degree angles. You usually want some kind of a bevel on there, and this is really handy. If I press the space bar, I've got it set to edge loop complete. I could also do a poly loop. If I selected this, it would bevel a poly loop. Change my target back to edge loop complete, and I can bevel this edge here. Now I can change those settings on that. I can adjust my edge sharpness. We can turn that down. I can also, let's go back to this again, and I can change to a linear edge or a sharp edge. Let's change it over here to sharp edge. And that gives me a totally different character to my edge there. It's a little bit sharper, whereas the other one's got a softer edge to it. So I mouse over this edge here. I can actually extrude edges, which we'll look at in a bit. Extruding edges is very nice because it allows you to do a type of retopology here inside of ZModeler. It's also really great for creating patterns for clothing and cloth if you're going to be creating costumes that you'll then use the cloth dynamics on. So let's take a look here where we have polygroup. So I'm going to mouse over a face, go to polygroup, and I will do polyloop. And if I click a polyloop here, it will add a new polygroup. Now, if I want a brand new polygroup, I don't want it to be that polygroup there, I'll click and then press the Alt key, and that will add a brand new polygroup. If I want to sample another polygroup, what I'll do is I will click, press Shift to sample my polygroup, and now I'm adding to that polygroup. So I can add everything that I want to that blue polygroup because I just sampled it. Now, if I go to QMesh and I will do polygroup island, I can then QMesh out everything that is that particular polygroup island that's touching itself. That's any faces that are touching together that are part of the same polygroup. So you can see that you can very quickly start to create some pretty neat things like this. If I were to take these faces here, and I'm going to Alt-click on these and then just extrude these out, you see what happens. I'm going to turn off, let's undo that. I'm going to turn off my dynamic subdivision levels. If I start to extrude these faces out, let's go back to here. Let's say I've got these two faces here extruded. Now if I take these two faces and extrude them, watch what happens. When I get up here, it's going to automatically snap to those other faces, and then I can extrude these two out again. So it's very, very smart in its behaviors. It's got this snapping ability that can be really, really handy. Now you can disable your snapping right here, so you don't have to actually use that, and you can change your attraction as well, set no attraction, weak attraction, etc. So all of that is something that you are able to manipulate using the settings for this tool. So let's do something really quick. Let's make a sword using ZModeler. So we've reinitialized ZBrush and we have a polymesh star here. We're going to go to the initialize menu and turn this into a Q cube, turn on frame mode with Shift F. Now I'm going to turn on X symmetry. Now we're going to build the handle and the hilt out from this. So I'm going to go to B for brush, Z for ZModeler, and select ZModeler. Now I'm going to extrude the handle down from the Z direction, or the Y direction. So I'll go to the space bar, and the first thing that I want to do is I want to inset these faces a little bit. So I'll select Inset, Polygroup Island, and I want to inset region, not each individual poly. So that way it's going to inset the entire region like that. Now I'll switch to QMesh, and we'll just extrude the handle down. But you see what's happening is it's not getting the whole polygroup. So go to QMesh and you see it's doing a single poly. So we go to Polygroup Island. That's going to be different for each operation. Then we'll extrude that down, and then let's do another one here. And let's do one more, and then I want to scale this down. So I'll press the space bar, go to scale, and make sure that we're scaling around the polygon center, and click drag. Now I'm going to create a quick polygroup right here by alt-clicking these two, and I'll go to QMesh, and let's just extrude these out to get a little sort of crossbar down here. Press the D key so we can preview our smooth mesh, and we can carry on working in this mode. So I'm going to go ahead and make a quick polygroup here by alt-clicking on these faces, and we'll extrude these out to make our hilt. So I'm going to extrude that, and then I'm going to scale these. So let's go to Scale, click Drag to scale those down, and then go back to QMesh. You can see it can be very, very quick to work this way because you're just pressing spacebar and then changing whatever operation you want to work on. So let me undo that one, and I'm just going to scale that out just a little bit more, or QMesh that out a little bit more, and then I'll scale these up. So I'll go ahead and press the space bar, go to scale, scale these up, and then go back to QMesh and QMesh them out. So now I'm going to go ahead and move these faces down here. So I'm going to leave my dynamic subdivisions. I'm going to mask these faces, invert the mask, just go to my transpose gizmo, and I can just pull those down just so the proportions are a little bit better. Clear my mask, and then press the D key to bring up my subdivisions again. So this is too smooth of a transition right here. So I'm going to select this edge, and I'm going to crease, edge loop complete, and then just click that. And we're creasing that entire edge loop. And perhaps I want to do something similar up here. Let's go ahead and crease this edge loop right here. So that gives me a nice sharp bit right there. But perhaps I want to add another edge loop here. So if I mouse over the edge, go to Insert, not Inset, but Insert, and I'll do Single Edge Loop, click and drag, and I can add an edge loop there. Now, mousing over that edge loop, I can also scale this. So if I go to Scale, and I will do Edge Loop Complete as my target, and then click drag, I can scale that down so we can get this nice scalloped shape there. So let's add another edge loop in the handle here. I'll go to Insert and click drag, and I can just interactively place this edge loop here. And I'll turn off frame mode for a moment. There we go. Just gives us a clearer look there for a second. And let's add another one here. Oops. Let me Shift F and Shift D. And I'm just going to insert another edge loop here. And insert one here. And then press the D key. There we go. And I think I kind of like this smooth transition down into the handle, but if I wanted to add another edge loop here, I could do that and then adjust that transition by adjusting the distance of that edge loop to the others. So now I'd like to actually put a blade on here. So what we're going to do is we're going to inset these faces. So I'm going to Alt-click to inset these faces, go to Inset, and I'm going to inset center and border, and I'm going to inset region. Now I can do standard or equidistant or legacy. If I do equidistant, this is new in ZBrush. It gives me an equidistant kind of scaling. And then if I do standard, this is going to give me a slightly different, and this is going to be a little different depending on the size of your polygon, the type of effect this gives you. But what I want to do now is I want to actually squash these down so I get like the thickness of the blade that I want. So I'm going to do another inset here, like this. And now I'm going to Control-Shift-Click on this polygroup. And I'm going to use my gizmo to just scale it like this. And then if I reveal all again, by Control-Shift-Clicking on the background, you can see now we have a thickness that's more in line with the blade. Now I can, if I undo that, mask this, reveal all, invert my mask. I can do this while the rest of the mesh is visible. You just want to be careful that you don't scale that out so it's kind of overlapping some other faces there. Like if I were to turn off my subdivisions, you can see what that's actually doing. So let me go ahead and clear my mask here. Shift D to turn off our subdivision levels. And I'm going to undo, just back a couple more. So we're just doing this one inset. So I'm going to go ahead. This. Now I'm going to Control-Shift-Click on that, mask it, invert my mask, go to my transpose gizmo, and I will just scale this in the Z direction like this. There we go. Now I want to extrude the blade from that, so I'll use Q Mesh to do that. So we'll just go ahead and clear the mask, mouse over one of these faces, and press the space bar, go to Q Mesh, Polygroup Island, and click and drag. And I'm going to do just a little distance there so I get a nice sharp angle there when I do the next extrusion. So when you're in a tight area like this, you got to be careful and make sure that you're actually clicking on a face and not an edge. So we can zoom out a bit and just make sure that we have a face selected, and we'll just pull that up. Now, of course, I could just go ahead and mask these points here, invert the mask, and then extend that blade up like this just to get a better idea of how long it's going to be. Then, of course, I can clear my mask, mouse over these edges, and press the space bar, and I'll do insert to insert multiple edge loops this time, and we can actually specify how many edge loops. So I can set it to, let's say, 8 edge loops. If I click that, it'll put 8 edge loops along there. We also have the option, as you can see, to polygroup those as we insert them. So we can set alternating polygroups, same polygroup, or just keep your polygrouping, which can be really, really handy. I'll show you that here. I'm going to go ahead and insert some polygroups along there. Now I've got these blue polygroups here, and I want to use these to create kind of a texture on this handle, like a knurled sort of grip. But this polygroup, so if I were to QMesh polygroup all, that's going to grab those other polygroups up there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo back to where I added my 8 edge loops here, and I'm going to insert 8 edge loops, keep polygroups. Click that, and now I don't have the overlapping polygroup when I come down here. And perhaps I want these edges to go all the way up to here. I'm going to mouse over this edge, and I'm going to delete edge loop complete. Click that, and then insert edge loops, alternating polygroups. There we go. Now I can QMesh, and I can get a nice kind of effect right there on that handle. And you see, as I extrude that out, those points, if you watch here, they are actually merging with one another. So I press the D key, I get that little bit of detailing there. So let's press the D key again so we can preview our smooth. Go into frame mode. Cool. So let's go ahead now and put a little bit more detail onto our handle here. If I wanted to make some changes, say, to the hilt, the crossbar of the hilt, we can add some more detail to this. I'll just Alt-click these faces. I will select the face, go to Inset, and Polygroup Island, Center and Border, and I make sure that we're insetting a region. So I've got these regions now, and then I can QMesh these faces. I'll do polygroup all because that's the only green polygroup. Oops, I clicked the edge instead. That's the only green polygroup there. If I push it through, we can create a negative space going right through those parts of the sword. Now, let's say we wanted to create a bridge between 2 sections. So this is something that's really neat that ZModeler does. It allows you to take 2 holes and then generate a bridge of faces between them, which I think is a pretty nifty thing. So let's say we're going to grab these 2 faces here. I am going to grab these 2 faces, and I'm going to grab these 2 faces. I'm going to press the space bar, go to delete, and I'm going to make sure that I'm set to polygroup all, and then I'll click those. Now I've cut 2 holes there, and it can be a little hard to see because ZBrush doesn't default to showing you back faces. So under Display Properties, under the Tool menu, turn on Double, and now we can see the back faces more easily. So now I'm going to turn off my smooth because it's going to be a little bit easier to see this with the smooth turned off. I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to mouse over this edge, press the space bar, and I'm going to select Bridge. 2 holes. Now I can do spline, I can do a circle, I can do arcs, and I can set it to interactive curvature and interactive resolution, or optimal for both of those, or half. We'll start with interactive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the first edge. And when I mouse over the edge, you see it says bridge 2 holes, click the first hole. So I've clicked the first hole, and now it's asking for the second hole. So if I mouse over this, there's the second hole. So I click on this, and it merges, it joins those 2. Let me do this again, zoomed out a little bit, so you can see it a bit easier. So I'm going to click the first hole here. Then I'm going to click an edge on the second hole. Now I will drag my mouse left and right, and I can change the arc, drag it up and down, and you can change the actual resolution. So I can do something like this. So it's click the first hole and the second hole, and it will bridge them. Press the D key, and then we can preview the result. Now it might be neat to do something with these purple lines or these purple groups here, but I don't really want to do anything with this purple group here. So what I'll do is I'll change this polygroup. I'll go to the spacebar and select polygroup, polyloop. And I just need to sample a polygroup first. So I will click and then press shift to sample that polygroup. Then I will click and that will replace that ring with the red polygroup. Now I shouldn't have a purple polygroup anywhere else, so I should be able to QMesh, extrude, polygroup all, and we'll go ahead and click, drag, and there we can actually scale that in or out, depending on what we're looking for. And if I want that to be sharper, then I can just click it again, and that'll give me a little sharper edge. But you notice it's picking up a different polygroup now. So be careful of that. You want to make sure that if you have something isolated to a specific polygroup, it's not picking up and applying that same modifier to a polygroup elsewhere in your model that maybe is off screen. So just be aware of what polygroups you are working with. So let's go ahead and alt-click these faces here and do the same on the back side, and we will inset polygroup island, and we'll just inset that in, and then we'll QMesh that in and create a little indentation here, something like that, just to add a little bit extra detail. Let's turn off frame mode. So let's say at this point we want to change our proportions again. Go into frame mode, Shift D to turn off our dynamic subdivisions, and I will just mask these out, go to the transpose gizmo, and then of course we can scale this out. So I'll just hold down the Alt key, move this down to here, and I'll scale it in X, and that'll give me a lot more length to that blade. Go ahead and clear our mask on that. We can also use our gizmo deformers on things like this. So if I go to the transform menu and go to taper, I can use my taper deformer here if I want to taper that blade in or out. So I could do something like this. Maybe I want to do something a little interesting and flare that blade like this. I could do something along this lines. And then when I press the D key, you see that I get this nice sort of almost, it's not quite a scimitar, but it's giving me this interesting sort of shape here. So if we want to bring that to a point, there's a few different ways we can do that. Probably the simplest one would be to turn off our dynamic subdivision levels and then just mask that point at the tip. Invert the mask, take the transpose gizmo and just move that point up like that. And then that's going to give us that point on the tip. Clear the mask, press the D key, and now we've got that point. Now, if we look at the side here, you see we've got that nice thin blade. So we don't have a real thick kind of chunky blade because we extruded that out from this point down here. We've got some nice sort of little detailing along the edges here, and we've seen how we can bridge holes to create interesting shapes like the pattern and the handguard that we've got here. So there's all sorts of things that you can accomplish using ZModeler and combining these tools together. Now, this isn't actual smooth geometry yet. This is a dynamically subdivided mesh. So how do we actually make this subdivided geometry? Go to the geometry menu, and under dynamic subdivision, remember this is where we went to set our flat subdivision levels. So if I turn up flat subdiv to 1, you see that gives me a totally different look to my sword. If I turn flat subdiv down, that gives me a softer kind of smooth. And the Q grid, the quick grid, you see that gives me a different effect as well. Now, you'll see that if I use the Q grid, we can also do things like adjust our bevel. So if I want to do a global bevel, I could do a bevel just by turning up my bevel slider here, or turning up my coverage slider here, and that will bevel all the edges. We can chamfer the edges, but I'm going to stay with my Q grid 0 and flat subdiv 1, like that. Now I want to make this into an actual mesh. So what I do is I click apply, and here you see I now have subdivision levels. So we go to turn off frame mode, Shift D to step down, D to step up. We have an actual subdivision mesh. So you can do quite a bit using ZModeler. This just sort of scratches the surface with the most commonly used tools, but once you get in there and start experimenting with it, they all function pretty much the same way, where you press the space bar over your component, you'll have a contextual window for your operations, and then modifiers for that operation. And next, we're going to take a look specifically at the edge extrusion function, which is actually new in ZBrush 2021. So I've broken this out into a separate chapter because it's a lot more content and it makes this easier to sort of navigate in sort of bite-sized chunks. So in the next video, we'll take a look at edge extrusion, a way to make a different type of blade, and then also how you can use edge extrusion to do remeshing. So I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.